to the former Scotland Yard Special Branch and MI6 officer and the author of Black Ops.
I was undercover for Special Branch in a jihadi organisation.
If you'd like to help Carlton keep producing the Black Spy podcast and receive episodes and information that's only available to Carlton's special Patreon agents, then you can donate as little as £3, €4 or $5 a month by signing up with Patreon. See the Black Spy podcast notes or Google Patreon Black Spy podcast and pledge your monthly amount. You can even win the opportunity to be a guest on the show. Thanks for listening. And don't forget to subscribe for free.
My name is Carlton King, and welcome to the Black Spy Podcast, the show which lifts the lid on the world of secret intelligence, national security, and armed governmental personal protection operations, and shines a light between those worlds and the world of geopolitics and how they intermingle. So welcome. And actually today's show was going to be one with a superb guest on, which I'll have on next week. Already recorded and ready to rock and roll, so you'll hear the guest next week. But what I had to do this week actually was deal with the issues that in the UK could potentially lead to the end of the present Prime Minister, Boris Johnson. Boris is basically the Teflon Boris, to which nothing sticks. However, over the last month or so, he has been taking absolutely massive hits in the press and indeed within the people for the actions that he's undertaken during the COVID crisis and the UK's lockdown, which I should say was not as strict as in very many other countries. So you could argue that he shouldn't have had any problems with it, but he has. But before we do this, what I do want to say is one of my regular listeners who has a cafe in Blackpool. So if you've ever been, what Blackpool is, it's basically a seaside town and used to be, frankly, the number one seaside town in the United Kingdom at one stage, especially for people in the north and for Scotland. And so it's very well frequented. This particular listener, she has a cafe there, which is called the Hungry Elephant, and deals up superb English food. So if you're ever in Blackpool and you need to have something to eat, you've been on the rides or the fairground or whatever you may have been doing there, or even to the Winter Gardens to see the dancing, which we have there, the Celebrity Come Dancing, Strictly Come Dancing, which they have, which has their show there. You know, you may want to pop in to the Hungry Elephant and grab yourself something to eat and have a word with the proprietor there, Janet Gom. Anyway, without further ado, let's get into the situation with Boris Johnson and all of the frankly disturbing situation that there's been over the last month. Now, it is my opinion what I'm going to be providing you with and my understanding of how things function in the United Kingdom that I'm going to be providing you with an element of insidership that I have had over the years. I mean, the first thing to say is that in the United Kingdom, frankly, very few people actually understand how the system works. Because unlike, say, in the United States or in Germany or in Spain that I know of, or France, we generally do not have classes as students which explains how the political process works in our country. So every American is aware that there's a break between, if you will, the judiciary and the way that the legislature functions. And they understand how that functions. In the UK, that's not really the case. So people are, they see an MP and they don't really know the difference between an MP, a member of parliament, and what a minister is. They don't really understand that, or what a secretary of state is. So let me just explain that very quickly, because it will help in explaining this and explaining how number 10 functions. Number 10 is the seat of the government of the United Kingdom, a little bit, and where the Prime Minister has his one of his homes, which he stays at, whilst working, of course. And this is important. So number 10 Downing Street, everybody will have heard of it because, of Britain's empire, but they probably don't understand necessarily how that particularly functions. So the Prime Minister sits there, he is the head of government, and he has an office around him with a personal private secretary and many, many others who work out of there. Not massively a lot of people, actually, because it's not that big, but people function out of number 10 Downing Street. Then you have the Cabinet Office, which functions in connection with that, although they have their own building, but they connect within that. And under today's system, you have more and more what they call SPADs, which are special advisors. And the Prime Minister has his number of special advisors. And then there's civil servants, who are the people who are in the Cabinet Office and who work directly to government, but work actually under the patronage of the Queen. That's to whom you provide your allegiance when you swear your oath. By the way, that's the same for the police, and that's the same for the army, and many others who swear an oath. They don't swear an oath to the government of the United Kingdom. They swear their oath to the Queen. Okay, and if it were a king, then to the king. So the royals are to whom you swear your oath. So that's quite important as to how it functions. And then you have ministers, that because number 10 also has where the cabinet sits and comes together and discusses what's going to happen. And the cabinet is made up of secretaries of state. And secretaries of state come under the Prime Minister. They each have their own area that they look into. So the Secretary of State for Defence, Secretary of State for the Home Office, Secretary of State for Education, for the Health Service, etc. So those are the top pinnacle. Each Secretary of State then has underneath them ministers of state as a general rule. And it could be several ministers of state. So in the defence example, there used to be about 3 Secretaries of State for Defence. So the ministers of state for defence who come under the Secretary of State for Defence. So they would report to the Secretary of State. The Secretary of State then reports to the Prime Minister. And these Secretaries of States are often part of the cabinet that make up how the United Kingdom is governed. You then go across to the House of Commons, where you have MPs. Now, I should say, all of these people, as a general rule, are MPs. Now, you can have people who are in the House of Lords who also have a position within government. They are not MPs. They are Lords, and the House of Lords is a throwback all the way back to when Lords with the King ran the country. And it's the second legislature. It is the bigger than practically any other, but for the Chinese second chamber, I believe, and that which has 1.5 billion people to look after, whereas we only have something in the region now of about 70 million people, maybe even 68 million only. So you can see this House of Lords is quite big, and House of Lords is split, and I won't go into a lot of that because of discussions about whether there should still be a House of Lords and whether it should be changed. But you have peers who are made peers for life. You have Lords who are Lords because 300 years ago their family, or 500 years ago, their family did something for the King and he gave them a title as a Lord. You have Lords who are basically the clergy of the Church of England, who are made Lords and allowed to sit in the House of Lords. And more you've got people appointees to the House of Lords. So again, these are not MPs, so they're not chosen by the people at all in any way, shape or means. They're often chosen by government or previously by kings and queens, etc. And all this comes in together. And then you have the Houses of Parliament, which are the ones that are directly chosen by the people, and they basically have a parliamentary position, but nearly all of your secretaries of state and ministers, because as I said to you, they could be from the House of Lords, are generally MPs. So they've got their MP work to do, Member of Parliament work to do, which deals with everything from failing the payment of dog payment failing to what's going to happen in their particular constituency, because it's made up into constituencies. You've then got this situation where we've got devolved governments in parts of the United Kingdom, so in Scotland, absolutely devolved, Wales, which has a devolved element to it, and in Northern Ireland. So, and they too have their own MPs that don't sit in the House of Commons, but sit in their devolved governmental areas. That's easy to understand for those who are parts of federations. So if you're a German, you understand the Länder. If you're an American, you understand the state. So these are like state individuals. Roundabout. Okay, so that's the way that comes up. But there are obviously also MPs from all of these areas, which are also MPs in the House of Commons. So that's the way it kind of worked. And before that, you used to have MEPs when we were part of the European Union, which we're not. So, Boris Johnson, let's get to him. Boris Johnson's claim to fame was that he was once the mayor of London, which is by far the most powerful city in the United Kingdom, be it economically, be it politically, be it socially. It's where the power base sits. The city basically has the economic cash that runs through because of financial transactions. But the mayor is not the mayor of the city. The city has its own particular area. So it's quite interesting. They have a Lord Mayor. So these are some of the anomalies of the United Kingdom. It's only 1 square mile, the city, by the way, I should explain. So, the whole way Britain functions is an anomaly. And the other aspect of that is, of course, that there isn't a written constitution. I suppose you could argue that the only really written element of the Constitution came out in about 1984, which was called the Police and Criminal Evidence Act. And that aspect basically put down in law what people who were arrested could do or could have, or what the police could do with them and how they could function by within the fact that they'd been arrested in habeas corpus, that the police had taken the rights from them, and how that had to function. And it actually told the police how they must function. But generally, there isn't a written constitution. The constitution is full of stated cases, things that happened that the then judiciary will take into account and say, yeah, this is what happened way back in 1845, so this is the stated case, and so that's how we think our constitution should function. When we were a member of the European Union, of course, European Union law was a lot of what judges took into account, which was, of course, written, but now we're not part of the European Union. They apparently take cognizance of European Union law, but it's not the primary law to which they function to. So it's a mumbo-jumbo, frankly, of how our country is run. So why did that matter? Why should you be aware of that? What difference does that make in terms of Boris Johnson? Well, I guess if you are fast and loose with how you function, if you're fast and loose with what you say about in Parliament, about what goes on, if you're fast and loose about listening to the public or not listening to the public, if you don't have a written constitution where everything is written down about what you can do, you can expand what you can do in a fashion that, unless it works with something that's previously happened, you can turn around and say that's just the way it is. And this is, I think, what has made Boris capable of running the government in a way that most other ex-prime ministers would look at and say, this is not right. So you have ex-prime ministers on the Conservative side. Boris Johnson, for those who don't know and are not in the UK, is a Conservative or a Tory leader. So you have such Tory, which is like the Republican Party, you could say. You have Tory leaders in the US. You have Tory leaders who will turn around and say, ex-prime ministers, that Johnson is a disgrace. I can name you Sir John Major for that. Theresa May has stated that in roundabout ways. Oftentimes in Britain, one doesn't openly say something. One says it in a manner that is somewhat more genteel, but gets the point over. So Boris has been able to work within this genteel area and push forward his own populism. He got what he would call Brexit done. Well, anybody who knows anything about Brexit, which is the British exit from the European Union, yes, Britain is no longer part of the European Union, but the process is by no means done. There's a whole swathe of aspects that must be looked into in order that we can function with the European Union on many issues, through the European Union on various other issues, agreed with the European Union on how we sell our goods and how we function. And these negotiations, this deliberation element that we're now going through, process, element's the wrong word, deliberation process we're now going through with this discussion will go on for years, literally years. So Brexit isn't done. I think British politicians have in some ways a very easy run at things. One, because of the lack of the constitution, but two, because of the often, and I've really got to say it, I think, the ambivalence of the British public. They seem to be less engaged in politics than you'll find in many other countries. So therefore, I'll take Germany as an example. If you go to Germany and the elections are coming up, it is discussed at a relatively highbrow level on every TV station that carries it. It's not discussed in a manner that is done in a basic way. So it's really something that allows British politicians to, frankly, get away with not giving full answers. It also allows a person who would be a popularist to get away with issues which they know, because they use a lot of focus groups in No10, they know that people are interested in. So let's take immigration example, and then to put around it untruths. So you'll have the situation whereby Boris Johnson, getting Brexit through, said, in order to control our borders and not to have as many people in the United Kingdom as we don't want, we have to leave the European Union. Now, the reality of the situation is that, yes, there was freedom of movement for the 27 other countries who are part of the European Union. They had freedom of movement to move backwards and forwards to Great Britain and work, live, function in this country as a citizen, because basically you're a citizen of the European Union. But so did Brits in all those 27 countries as well. The way that it was put over was that we can leave the European Union and Brits will still have that freedom to work in 27 other countries, work in 27 other countries, do what they want, move when they want, and all the rest of it. But that people from 27 other countries won't have the right to do it in Britain. That was what was left to the public to believe. But it was worse than that. They were also suggesting that there'd be no immigration because we wouldn't allow any Africans in or Asians in or others whom the British public didn't seem to want into their country. What wasn't said, of course, is that under the EU laws, we could have stopped every African coming into our country, every Asian coming into our country, every South American, every Australian, if we so wished. Because the European Union basically only said that you have to take European Union citizens. Anybody from outside the European Union was effectively at the hands of the government of the country whom was setting the immigration. So if it was Germany, it was Germany. If it was Sweden, it was Sweden. If it was Great Britain, it was Great Britain. So we didn't have to have anybody from any other part of Europe other than the European Union and from any other part of the world entering the UK. If we so chose, none of them needed to come into the country. But Boris never told people that. So what you had was a lot of people who voted for Boris because of immigration, because they thought he will stop immigration. The reality was, though, that if you stop immigration from the European Union, because of the way the UK functions, you'll have to fill that immigration from elsewhere. So instead of having less people from Africa, Asia, South America, whatever, it would lead to more people from Africa, Asia, wherever, coming to Britain. Because Brits either didn't have the capability or capacity to do the jobs that these people were doing, or didn't wish to do the jobs that these people were doing. And therefore, they'd have to get them from somewhere. So you see, this provided, however, Boris Johnson with fertile ground, as it would in many, many other countries. Immigration is always an easy route for a leader to push themselves forward. And so Boris was able to utilise this, which the reason why I mention all of this is because it's given Boris, if you will, that Teflon element. So he's done many, many, many a thing wrong. But because of this immigration element, that many British people look to and say, yes, well done, Boris, he has had a freedom to actually act in a manner that wasn't positive in terms of his role as Prime Minister. So now we come to the present situation, and this is where Boris is now beginning to fall. Because in the United Kingdom, we've had the pandemic like everywhere else. Indeed, the numbers of deaths in the United Kingdom have been higher than in many other countries, practically than in every other European country for sure. However, the way the propaganda's been placed is that it hasn't been. Once again, because of the fact that Boris took a chance, and before we had fully checked every aspect of the vaccine which we would utilise, Boris authorised the use for the vaccines amongst the British people. And it paid off, because the vaccines seemed to be successful and the British people were vaccinated quite quickly. So that was ahead of the rest of Europe. And it's much vaulted by Boris every time, in fact, he speaks, so that we're ahead of Europe. Well, the reality is that we're ahead of some countries in Europe, because since they checked the vaccine, it went through the European Medicines Program, and they then said the vaccines were correct. They have actually, in some countries, Germany being one of them, ahead of us on actually vaccinating their populations. And some are behind. But to just say Europe is again misleading. Now, this is what Boris has done all the time. And I say Boris because that's why we just call him Boris. He's managed this familiarity that is different than other politicians. You wouldn't just say John for Sir John Major. You'd say John Major. So this is what he's done. He's made himself a popularist, and that has stood him in good stead with the general working people in the nation. And indeed, he was able to take over, his MPs were able to take over some of the constituencies, which as a general rule used to sit with the working class party, which is known as the Labour Party. Whether it is the working class party is questionable, but that's what it was. And for years, they had run certain places in the north of England and beyond, which would always vote Labour. Boris, as he's called, has been able to take over many of those constituencies, his MPs winning in those constituencies. So his MPs in those constituencies owe a lot to Boris. So they are not going to challenge him. Now, until now, of course, where potentially it's becoming problematic because he made the biggest faux pas he could make. He's always been fast and loose with rules and regulations. Indeed, as far as I know, he was one of the very, very, very few, I'm laughing as I say it and I shouldn't do, journalists who has been fired from a newspaper for lying. Now, yes, I know it sounds improbable that journalists don't tell the truth always, and that, there are 1,001 ways of hiding what is truth and implying something else, because that's what most newspapers are built on. But Boris has done it in such a fashion that he was fired for it, not once but twice. So there you have the problem. It's clearly an individual who, to get over what he requires to do, for fame and fortune or whatever he wants, he's able to and willing to say whatever is required in order to do that. And this is what he's been like in public office. And I think he's been allowed to do that because his party has seen how much of an electoral success he is. And people owe their positions in constituencies to that electoral success. But now he's actually, as I said, gone past what many people will see as righteous. So let's go back to what we're actually talking about. So Britain was put down in lockdown. As I said, it wasn't as strict a lockdown as in many, many other countries, particularly in the European Union and beyond, but it was perceived as strict for Britons. For English in particular, Scots, notably, Welsh, in some cases Northern Irish, have had stricter lockdowns. But in England, it's been perceived as such, Boris not wanting to lock people down. But what he did say is you could only do certain things within a certain time period, and I don't want to go through the whole thing, but within a certain time period where you had X amount of bubbles. So you had a bubble, which they called it, of X amount of people, some cases 2, some cases a family, some cases beyond, depending on when the time and era was of the pandemic. So you'd have to go back all the way back through the pandemic to come forward. But the British people understand when it was. But what was clear is you couldn't just go out and have parties. You couldn't mix with people who you were not mixing with as a family, or you're not mixing with in terms of work. Because in terms of work, you had to have distance and all the rest of it. But most people were told not to go to work. However, some areas, and obviously, if you're in the health system, you had to go to work. If you're a driver of transportation to get food around and whatever else, you had to go to work. If you're in the police, obviously you had to go to work. The military, you had to go to work. And of course, in one of these areas, if you're a civil servant running the country in Downing Street, you had to go to work. But of course, none of that allowed you to have parties at work, because that was going against the regulations which were set out. It has come to light that several parties have happened, some of which Boris was actually there himself enjoying the parties in some way, shape or means. There's even one where his wife was there. He's drinking wine. Now he's arguing that these were business meetings in my residence, and this is why right in the beginning I spoke about his residence being number 10. So he's come down into the garden and he's drinking in the garden with, I think people counted, said 40 people or whatever the number was, and he was saying it was a work meeting, not a party. Unfortunately for him, what has happened is, I believe, is that this is a concerted effort to try and get rid of Boris Johnson by parties unknown. And the newspapers have got hold of this. Some papers actually positive to Boris have got hold of this. And unfortunately for him, the person or persons providing the information are drip feeding it out. So as to happen is, it started before Christmas, and then every week there's another photo or another time when Boris Johnson has done something wrong in terms of having a party or not sticking to the rules. Because what it shows is, and this has been a mantra of the opposition party, the Labour Party, one rule for them and another rule for us. So he's played into that. And so it's now making it popular. You've got to understand that people were not allowed, example, to go into hospitals and see their loved ones when they were dying. They were only allowed to have, let's say, 6 people at a funeral. They weren't allowed to hold the hands of, their mother, grandmother in a old people's home, example. So when those making the rules then decide to do absolutely contrary to that and just go out and drink and have fun, you've now got a problem. Now, the first times these issues came up, the Prime Minister Boris Johnson came into Parliament and said everything was done by the book, by the rules. Now, this is one of the problems he's now got, because what you can't do as a Prime Minister is lie to Parliament. Yes, you can be economical with the truth. Yes, you can be on the cusp and make things up or whatever else you can, but you can't be caught in a lie. So if you turn around and say everything was done per the rules and it wasn't, and you knew it wasn't, now you've got a problem. So now we start bringing this issue out much wider. Because, of course, as you know, as with practically any governmental or ministerial or presidential residence around the world, it's guarded by police. So the problem for this is that the police clearly understood there must have been some type of thing going on that probably wasn't to the norm, that wasn't within the regulations. And the police are the body that obviously functions within the regulations. Now, the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, the area which would look into these issues, the police force in the area that would look into these issues, said when this first came to light of potential wrongdoings in number 10, that as a general rule, they didn't work retrospectively against regulations that were COVID orientated, because it came out like 6-9 months later or a year later. So they were basically saying, well, it is our norm not to look retrospectively at issues and to charge people retrospectively for issues relating to COVID. Now, a lot of journalists said, oh, retrospectively do it all the time. And that is absolutely true, because the vast majority of cases are retrospective. But the Commissioner was specific. She was saying, as per the COVID regulations. The problem with that, however, is that that can be perceived that there's different treatment being provided to the Prime Minister and cohorts in number 10 than there is to the general public with general crimes. So if I were the Commissioner, I would have said, yes, we don't generally work retrospectively, but in this case, because as if it were a police officer doing something one shouldn't do, you'd look at it much more closely. And indeed, there is an inquiry going on presently looking into actions of police, which were, in a general rule, totally above board and in line with most things that they were meant to do. But the inquiry, called by the Home Secretary previously, Theresa May, before she was Prime Minister, is now going to cost the United Kingdom probably about £1 billion. Yes, you heard it, £1,000 million to look into this inquiry, which at the end of the day will say nothing. So clearly people do look into things retrospectively, and particularly when it's police. And you do that because police have a role that says they've got to be above board. So how much more above board must government be, and MPs, the legislature, the people that make the laws, not only the ones that carry them out, the people that actually make the laws. So you could argue that if you're making the law, surely you should be held to an even higher level than the people who only carry out what you've made into a law. So if it were me as the Commissioner, I would have said, yes, we will look into this case. After all, what would have happened to them if they were found guilty? Generally, in these COVID cases, there could be fixed penalty signs. That means paying a fine of £60 or whatever, £100. Or you could be taken to court. Now, one of the elements is, I guess, with this whole case, is that he hasn't only done it once. So the people in number 10 and him, and let's face it, if this is his office and where he works, the person who actually sets the culture of number 10 can only be the Prime Minister, because that's where he lives, that's where he works, that's whom everybody works to. So the culture that is alive there must be the culture that the Prime Minister has set in vain. So yes, always you want to look at it, the police should have taken some action, and they didn't, and haven't up to now. So another drip came out a week later. The Prime Minister once again involved, number 10 involved in another party of some sorts. Then a leaving do for somebody leaving, who happened to be leaving to go to a powerful newspaper that supports the Prime Minister, The Sun. And again, no action. So now people are saying, hold on, what's going on? One of the Prime Minister's primary allies at one stage, who later has now become an absolute enemy of the Prime Minister, he's number 1 special advisor. He is clearly letting information flow as well. He's letting things out and saying, hey, listen, you think that was a party? This was a party on this day. And he's giving day, date, time and place. The name of the man is called Dominic Cummings, for those who do not know. British people will know him. He's the guy who actually did work towards making the vote for Brexit the Brexit vote. He's the eyes and ears. He's the brains. He's the one that made it happen. Boris Johnson was, if you will, the figurehead. Cummings was the one who made it happen. And he was given a free hand in government to do what he wanted until he went against the rules, and in the end, seemingly because it got too hot, was fired by Johnson in the end. And I think what Cummings is saying is, I'm going to get you back. He's not saying that in so many words, but you can see how information's drip feed into press and how it's coming out all the time. So we have this internecine warfare in number 10 and those who were in number 10. But it spreads out even further. So we had a situation whereby people were baying for the Prime Minister's blood just this week, which is why I'm doing this special. He was on the cusp of actually having to go, potentially. Now, the reason why I think he hasn't gone already is because who wants this poison chalice? Because coming down the line, I believe, are going to be more exposés about more people, secretaries of state maybe, and ministers maybe, who should have known if they weren't involved in these parties, but should have known that they took place, assuming they weren't involved. And even if they were involved, or even if they were far away from them, it shows a cultural perspective of the Tory party under Boris Johnson, how they're fast and loose with how things pertain to them as opposed to them pertaining to the rest of the public. So, who wants this poison chalice? Who wants the poison chalice of Brexit and what it means for the UK in terms of its economy hitting them by taking over the role of Prime Minister? Because it will happen. When the pandemic goes, there'll be no excuse as to why the UK's economy is not rolling along or roaring along, but sitting behind that of most powerful European countries of the same vein, that's the point, of the same vein of the United Kingdom. So there'll be that problem. So does anybody really want that at this stage? So they want to keep Boris in power anyway, just to have him as the whipping boy. You had Boris taking money for his premises for it to be refurbished. I mean, he missteps a lot of times, but that's been one of his problems. He doesn't read the briefs, and I know that personally. He doesn't understand what one should do and what one shouldn't do. He, example, ditched his protection team on one occasion and then went off to a party in Italy without his protection team, and that party was being run by the son of an ex-KGB FSB officer who is a billionaire and tight with Putin. There was then a dossier called the Russian dossier that was made to cover all these angles about how difficult it has been for the Conservative Party in particular and its connections with Russian oligarchs, i.e. billionaires, and what was going on. That was held back by Johnson for nearly a year. When it did come out, much was redacted, and it was pushed out at a time when nobody would be watching and listening. So what I'm saying to you is there are questions to be answered before this particular line that we've come through. But the problem is that this one hits the general public because, do the general public bother about whether he's connected to Russian oligarchs or whether, he charges some Russian oligarch's wife 30,000 to play tennis with him? They're probably not that bothered. Are they bothered that he took 60,000 from another guy and then said, I'll look into the thing that you might, or it is alleged, and all these are allegations, it is alleged that I'll look into this issue that you might want looking at in terms of a exposition. Yeah, but he took 60 grand from this guy. All these things can be looked into and all these things can be mashed away and because the British public don't understand it, and as I said before, the major element is that the British public is, as a general rule, apathetic to politics. A survey was done indeed some several years ago about what European Union citizens in various European Union countries, and when we were part of the European Union, thought about politics, and Britain was the lowest. So you have this process in the UK where people are not that interested, so you can get away with all this. But of course, the way things are being dripped out now, so example, as a general rule, many Britons respect the Queen. So when the Queen's consort, her husband, died, elements of society, many, were in mourning that the Queen's husband had died and felt for the Queen. That very day, there was another party in number 10. So this is where you have your problem. And that connection is being made. While the Queen sat by herself with nobody next to her, as far as we could see, in number 10, people were having a party thereafter, drinking wine, and everything was as though there was no problem. Whilst the Queen was sitting to the rules, with nobody next to her, Mr. Johnson's people, and it said him himself, alleged him himself, was actually at a party where those rules are not being kept to. So again, people will see that connection. And this is damaging for him. But what I'm saying is, this is how it comes out in other ways on how it's damaging for the country. Because, of course, there is no doubt to my mind that just this week, when it was getting very, very hot, a story dropped. And it was that China was looking very closely at Labour individuals, Labour Party, which is the opposition party, and indeed that over 5 years, one Labour Party MP had been assisted to the tune of £500,000 around that area by a Chinese national who's said to be working for the Chinese intelligence service in some way, shape or means. Where means not clarified. And that her son was working in the office of this MP, Barry Gardner. Now, the problem is this. Having spent many a year in and around politics, I can tell you that most MPs and others have connections with foreigners. And foreigners provide money to these MPs in some way, shape, or means, because it's not disallowed in the United Kingdom, as you've heard with the Russians, with the Tories. And indeed, this same Chinese person was given a medal by the former Prime Minister, who was a Tory, a Conservative, Theresa May. So why was that dropped at that time? It doesn't take rocket science to understand that that was dropped in order to, as the Germans would say, Ablenkung, so in order to push your view elsewhere. So you were not looking at Boris, but you were looking at this issue. And also saying, by the way, Labour Party are also up to no good. Now, why is this important? Number one, they've utilised the security service to do this. So that in itself is a problem. It brings the security service into the political arena, which should never be the case. Number two, they spoke about the security service, supposedly, if this is true, spoke about saying it didn't come to a criminal perspective, so no criminal action has been taken. Well, it isn't up to the security service to say what's criminal and what isn't. That's the job of the police. So it's put, in my mind, the security service down a road that's talking now about whether police action should be taken when the police decide what police action is. So again, feeding into areas that it shouldn't be. More importantly, it's actually saying to the people, all politicians are negative. Forget them all. Plague on all of you. So it's bringing all politicians into disrepute. By an implication, rightly or wrongly, now they're saying Gardner's done nothing wrong, but they're making a suggestion with money. But so people are turning around and saying, well, Tories are rubbish. Labour's rubbish. They even said Liberal Democrats are rubbish. Now, I know, running the Israeli team at one stage, protection team, I can tell you that Israel had good relations with everybody. Example, all politicians from every political area. Because that's what states do. They make sure they do have good relations with every politician from all different parties. Because that's what they're going to utilise to get something favourable to them. The United States does it. Germany, every country does it. And we do it in other countries. That's just the way it is. That's how politics functions. But they're making it out as negative. And in doing that, you're putting a plague on all politicians. So you've got an apathetic country in terms of politics anyway, and now you're making it worse. And all you're doing in addition to that is you're saying a populace can make things happen because we want to get rid of foreigners. We don't like them. Get them out of our country. And this is what he's saying. So you're actually pulling the lid off an immigration aspect as well, which is making people think that all immigrants are coming to Britain. When indeed, if you look in the European Union, one of the lowest people for taking any type of immigrant at all is the United Kingdom. So again, we've got a problem. And again, you're making fizzes in our society which we can't necessarily withstand. And we're seeing it in Northern Ireland, actually. Because of the bad decisions made on Brexit, Northern Ireland is probably slowly moving towards some type of communal violence again, at which line you don't know where it will end. And this is the danger with people who work on the cusp of political relevance and irrelevance. When you work on that cusp, you're coming into the territory of extremism. And it allows the extremist and subversive groups to utilise what you're saying to further their actions, which is designed to undermine the state. And if you're as a politician and aiding that, and particularly if you're the Prime Minister aiding and abetting that, just by your actions, I'm not saying it's a purposeful aid and abet, but by your actions, because it's not thought through, that is a big, big problem. So this is why today I thought I had to speak about this issue. As I said, last week I thought I had to speak about Sidney Poitier. This week I had to speak about our Prime Minister and the goings on. And, you're going to have to look to see what happens in the future as to what happens to Boris, whether he stays in power for long or he doesn't, whether he is now fatally damaged or he is not, whether extremism gets worse. I believe it will, because I believe what's been, the genie's been let out of the bottle, and I believe that genie will come to haunt people in time to come. But you're going to have to look at all of this and say, was that the right move? As I said, I felt I must put this forward. I've obviously always tried to make my talks not boring, not too deep, so they, put some people off. I've tried to have guests on so you can see different views, and as I said, next week we'll be back to guests again so you can understand where we're coming from. And by the way, some of the guests we're going to look into cryptocurrency, for one. We're going to look into the city and the financial areas. We're going to look into that. Where's the UK going? How have its finances been moved forward with an absolutely fantastic guest. So, as I said, we've got the city, we've got crypto. I've got lined up a professional footballer who hopefully we're going to talk about that Premiership football as well. And in addition to that, I've got an A-list actor that we're going to have on the show as well. I've got then a producer because, there's so much content coming out on television. I think people need to understand how that all functions, how it all works. So I've got a producer lined up in terms of how TV functions and streaming working and the way forward. So, I've got some fantastic shows coming forward, but I wanted to hit this one. I wanted you to understand how the world of politics works in the United Kingdom. So thank you very much for listening, guys and gals, and I hope to have you listen and learn next week. See you then.
If you'd like to help Carlton keep producing the Black Spy podcast and receive episodes and information that's only available to Carlton's special Patreon agents, then you can donate as little as £3, €4 or $5 a month by signing up with Patreon. See the Black Spy podcast notes or Google Patreon Black Spy podcast and pledge your monthly amount. You can even win the opportunity to be a guest on the show. Thanks for listening, and don't forget to subscribe for free.
Here is a working class spy telling his stories, the secrets, the lives of spies. Feel free to message Carlton King on all socials and give this show 5 stars on Apple iTunes and subscribe so you never miss a single episode. For your ears only.
I was a member of Her Majesty's Secret Intelligence Service.